Hello and good afternoon from the IST conference. We are here in the last keynote session, and thank you, Karoline, for coming to us virtually.
With pleasure.
Karoline Rogge is Professor for Sustainable Innovation and Policy at University of Sussex in the UK, and Deputy Head of the newly founded Competence Center Policy and Society at Fraunhofer Institute in Germany. In her inter- and transdisciplinary research, she focuses on transformative policy mixes for accelerating sustainability transitions, particularly in the energy sector, which I'm very grateful that you will also talk about in your speech, which is on exactly the topic, transformative policy mixes as accelerating sustainability transitions in energy. And as far as I understood, you will have 3 parts in your presentation, and the last part is on energy. Okay, then I give the floor to you, and for the audience, enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus, for this introduction, and thanks for inviting me to give this final keynote to what has been a really exceptional and super stimulating conference. And I'm just going to share my screen with you. And I hope you can see it now, so that, I can start my talk about a topic that's really at the heart of my research, policy mixes, that I've been doing at SPRU and Fraunhofer ESI for, over 15 years. So in my talk, I want to obviously talk about policy mixes and what makes them transformative. Very much of what we have learned is coming from the energy sector, but I hope it has wider relevance as well. But then I will also embed this into the wider sustainability transition research agenda, and particularly look at it in terms of the methodological diversity of our work. And I want to highlight one further part in my talk, which is really key for transformative policy mixes, and that is social innovation. Okay, so with that, I get us started. We live in a time of really complex, interconnected, systemic challenges, crises, emergencies. And I'm not talking just about COVID-19, the economic recession, inequality, climate change, and ecological degradation, just to name a few. So it's my conviction that to address these challenges, we need transformative policy mixes. Most of these challenges can be traced back to the way we have organized our systems of production and consumption. And I really like this graph from the recent EEA report on the European environment, which places our transitions thinking in the middle at the heart of the production and consumption systems, and puts this within the ecosystem, and thereby combining it really nicely with thinking within ecological economics. And clearly we have surpassed our planetary boundaries, and we need to radically change our ways of producing and consuming. And we have put strategies in place, even at the international level, the Paris Agreement, Sustainable Development Goals, and these have been translated further down to targets on national, regional, and city levels. We have a lot of climate neutrality targets and so on. But what's really lacking behind is to implement that with real action, so that we actually can see the transformative change that we need. And the question is really, of course, also if the recovery packages that are being put in place, if they are really green, if they're really delivering to achieve our ecological targets set out in Paris and the SDGs and beyond these ecological targets. So the great thing is that we as a community, transition studies, have a lot to offer to help and understand how such socio-technical systems can change and how to accelerate such change towards sustainability. And we have been really prolific in producing knowledge, and we need to get it out there, of course. We have over 4,000, well, almost 4,000 publications in transitions research out there. In our specific transition journals, it's a bit less. It's about 20% published in our 5 core journals. But the point here is that actually half of these studies really deal with policies. So we do have a lot of knowledge about how policies could steer, could accelerate transition processes. If it comes to the newer themes, such as politics of transitions or policy mixes, but also really at the heart of governance, there's much less attention. There are still significant studies out there, but it's just emerging, and I would argue we need more work on that. So before I dive in one of these on policy mixes, I want to look into how this subset of studies fits into the wider transitions community and what we have been publishing. And here I want to explore the methodological diversity in our field. And this is based on work that I've been doing with my colleagues Henrik Hansmeier and Katharina Schiller at Fraunhofer ISI, where we have been doing a scoping exercise before merging out into further projects to look into the state of research in the past 4 years. And I want to share this with you because I think it's of broad relevance for the whole community. We are using the transition research onion introduced by Sofagarian and co-authors in their recent article, where they looked at all the publications published in our 5 key journals until 2015. And what we have been doing is then to update this, and I want to show you how we are developing as a field. And just look at some of these layers from the transition research onion. Let's start with research questions. If you look at that, and in the light green, you can obviously see what has happened before 2016. And then in the dark green, you can see what has been the state of the more recent past, the recent years until 2019. And the first thing you can observe, and that's of course great for my keynote on transformative policy mixes, the most popular research question now is on transition policies and pathways. And we also have seen much greater attention to actors and networks and how they influence transition processes, which I think are 2 very important developments. You can also see that there's less focus on explaining past transitions. So we are really changing as a field and taking up new challenges. If we move on to theoretical frameworks, there you can see our 4 core theoretical frameworks: the multi-level perspective, the technological innovation system approach, the strategic niche management, and transition management. And together, they actually only make up under 30% of the studies that we have been put out in the past 4 years. But the MLP remains the dominant framework among the 4. But what's actually much more interesting is that we have seen an expansion of frameworks borrowed from other disciplines that have been developed there to investigate how transitions unfold, investigate transition processes. So almost half of our studies are using such borrowed framework, showing how open we are as a community. What you can also see is that there is still significant development of new frameworks where we're combining concepts from different disciplines and bring them together, perhaps also developing the established core theories further by adding certain elements which were missing. And there's still significant attention to that. 1/4 of the studies do this, but less than before, which maybe shows us a bit that we are settling as a field. In terms of research methods, what has changed is what you see in the pie chart, that we are working more now on empirical studies than before. So there's lesser attention on conceptual studies. But what hasn't changed is really our focus on qualitative research approaches. Over 80% of our studies work this way, and only around about 10% in the past and still in the recent past are using quantitative research methods or mixed methods designs, quali-quanti combined. If you look at data collection and data sources, you can see no significant changes. We're still largely drawing on documents and interviews and combining multiple sources. But one interesting thing is emerging, and that's on the bottom. You can see others, and that is basically a collection of things that we have creatively come up to use in addition to the categories that were already in a Solfagarian article. And that could be that we draw more on statistics such as patent data, that we draw on media data, social media data, that we draw on experiments that we conduct, and very few beginnings with using big data. but still more a handful. And so we should just, with all this creativity going on to develop in the future, if someone is going to update what we're doing as a field, to have some more categories here. Last one, time horizon. In the past, our studies have been largely longitudinal research designs, and that is going down a bit. So you can see that we now have 30% of studies doing cross-sectional analysis at one point in time. But of course, making sense for transitions as long-term processes, we still have the majority of our studies are longitudinal research designs. Okay, so I want to compare this with the policy mix research that I want to be talking about. And that is, let's compare the subset, which arguably is still small, but still that has been produced between 2016 and 2019 with all the other transition studies and see how we're doing. So in terms of empirical focus, you can see it's the same, not that much conceptual work, but really empirical applications. But the policy mix subset is a bit more quantitative and a bit more adopting mixed methods approach. And I think that's a direction where perhaps the community as a whole maybe want to develop. There are, in terms of the data sources that are being used, it doesn't look so different apart from a few things, fewer interviews, more surveys. No workshops, surprisingly, which I think, though, could be quite important, and rarely creative use of other resources. So perhaps that's something that we can pick up in the future. In terms of the time horizon, that's nearly the same. So 3/4 of the studies are of a longitudinal nature. And in terms of theory, what is particularly different is that there's more attention to developing new frameworks, which makes sense as it's a new and emerging field and still some work needs to be done. Okay, so that brings me to the heart of my talk. What are policy mixes? And actually, what can we learn from policy mix research? And yeah, I will have maybe 15 minutes to go into that. If you want to hear more, there is a longer webinar that I gave for the NEST webinar series a month ago. And you're welcome to find out more afterwards in this webinar. I want to start with two prominent definitions in transition studies for policy mixes, so that we're all on the same stage and know what we're talking about. Both of them share that they go beyond just focus on instruments and how they're interacting, which was what was being done in the early economic studies. Here the definition by Florian Kern and Mike Howlett, stressing two things. Policy mixes are complex arrangements of multiple means, so the instruments, and multiple goals. And the second thing, that these, in many cases, develop incrementally over many years. And that's already then a way of explaining why, over time, perhaps policy mixes become inconsistent or incoherent because of the processes of policy change going on. The second definition is by me and Christine Reichert, who did her PhD at Utrecht. And we really wanted to put together an interdisciplinary definition, drawing on innovation studies, policy studies, but also on economics. And so we came up with this broad understanding of policy mixes integration project, where we differentiate between three different building blocks that should be taken into consideration when thinking about policy mixes. So you can see the one that is at the center and at the heart of the policy mix concept, the elements of the policy mix. And the elements are the policy output, the output of the policy process. And you can differentiate there, well, the instrument mix, yes, so the different combinations of instruments, but also important to look at the policy strategy and this long-term element of policy. And I think that's really important for transitions because we're talking about long-term transformative change. The second building block is about policy processes. And this is both in terms of, well, clearly they're important for shaping the elements, but also they can have a direct impact on socio-technical change. And so in transition studies, we argue that should be taken seriously and paid attention to. The third building block is about policy mix characteristics. So what you already heard in terms of consistency and coherence, but also credibility and comprehensiveness of the policy mixes. And I come back to that in a little bit. Okay. So in terms of policy mixes, we have really an active emerging research community. There are 2 recent special issues on the topic. One on energy transitions and policy mixes. The other one on policy mixes for sustainability transition, really trying to drive home the message we need to combine conceptual approaches, theories, and so on, fund innovation and transition studies and policy studies to look in an integrated manner at policy mixes, transformative policy mixes for sustainability transitions. And then there are a number of reviews, book reviews, but also policy reviews, which summarize the state of the art of this very active field. Yeah, ranging from what is something that's being communicated to us in our community, but also to other communities such as the policy design community, or broader to practitioners and policymakers through the EEA report. Now, this really active field, which has really started to emerge around 2003, has almost 180 authors contributing to it here. You can only see the top authors, top organizations, top journals, but I do want to share that there are more than these, and we have over 130 organizations where the authors are affiliated with and contributing to this emerging body of research on policy mixes. The main journals that you can see in the middle that are publishing our research are our main transition journals, plus an energy research and social science. So it's research policy, it's technological forecasting and social change, it's energy policy, it's IST. Now, what can we learn from this research that has been quite active? For that, I want to talk a bit about what we can learn for climate policy mixes, because that's exactly a question I've been asked. You know, what can we learn from this broader research on policy mixes for climate policy mixes by the lead authors of the upcoming report by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and their 6th assessment report for their chapter on national and subnational policies and institutions. So for that, they asked me, you know, we have the economists covering the instrument interactions, but can you give us a literature review on what is emerging from this broader understanding of policy mixes? And so I looked into the literature. Actually, climate policy mixes is even more than what would be coming from our transitions and innovation studies communities. So you can see the orange line there. About 30% of the studies on policy mixes are really addressing climate policy. But there's actually quite a large overlap with innovation policy mixes and with policy mixes for transitions. So I looked through these studies, the most recent ones, the past 5 years, sorted out half of them because they were an instrument interaction already covered elsewhere, and then tried to write a synopsis in 4 pages with 10 key messages. What is the outcome of our current knowledge about policy mixes for climate mitigation? And I'm not going to go through all these 10 key messages, but if you're interested, I'm happy to share this afterwards. I want to highlight three of them, which I think are particularly important for transformative policy mixes. Okay, so the first one is number 4. Climate policy mixes need to be credible to accelerate low carbon transitions, right? Because the report is much about acceleration, because we do need to accelerate. So credibility is one of the policy mix characteristics, which has been taken up both by economists and recognized in modeling exercises. This is super important for climate policy to be credible. But then in transition studies, we have looked into, okay, and how do you generate credibility? What makes a policy mix credible? And our early findings are that, well, yes, it's about the instruments and how stringent they are and whether they're aligned with the targets. So can the targets actually be achieved? Is the ambition level of the instruments which are implemented actually sufficient for that? But it's more. And what is actually striking in studies is that it's really the way of the policy style. So we're in the policy process domain, right? How policymakers interact with stakeholders, how much they listen to the problems that they're out there, how much they're addressing barriers really quickly, how open and transparent is the procedure of policy making, are all stakeholders being invited, and so on. So these are things that maybe we don't usually think about when we talk about policy mixes, but when we talk about transformative policy mixes, this is really crucial. It's crucial because it establishes credibility that policymakers are really seriously really serious about their ambition, about the targets and the strategies being put out to also achieve them, that they move forward. And one way to be very pragmatic in creating such credibility is, of course, to implement phase-out policies. That's point 6 that I want to highlight here. And that's, of course, tricky. But if that's happening, coal phase-out, and ambitious coal phase-out, not delayed coal phase-out, which is happening much later than as it would have happened with carbon pricing, but ambitious phasing out of the support that actually is in place, such as fossil fuel subsidies for carbon-intensive fuels, for carbon-intensive technologies and practices as well. If that's being done, then the actors in the system understand, okay, policymakers are really serious about these transformative change. They really want radical change. It's not just Sunday talk. And of course, directly, if you do this, if you phase out this policy support, and here we are, at a destructive dimension of creative destruction. It's what Paula Kievemer and Florian Kern put forward as we need these kind of policy mixes for creative destruction. This destruction part can clearly accelerate low carbon transitions. It generates a level playing field. The problem, though, is, of course, and that's the third point I want to highlight, there's lots of vested interests, right? People are going to lose from this. And so it's really, really hard to implement. And I think that's one of the main reasons why I'm saying we need, when we talk about transformative policy mixes, we need to combine much more, integrate politics and policies. Because one with the other doesn't really work with transitions and transformative change. And what, as a community, we need to find is ways how to navigate that resistance from vested interests. And there are promising ideas out there. It's looking at building coalitions, perhaps through the sequencing of policies over time. So really taking this dynamic perspective of thinking, okay, what are the policy feedbacks emerging from something I'm doing now? And then what I can do in 2 or 3 years' time. And these, we should, of course, try to get positive feedbacks going, but there actually may be negative feedbacks, which I need to foresee so that they don't occur. And that could mean I need to compensate losers. Yeah, I need to address the downside of the transformative change, talking about reskilling, for example, right? Regional redevelopment and so on. So this all becomes part of transformative climate policy mixes. And in the end, that means that the different policy domains need to be talking to each other. It's not a simple exercise, it's complex, but it needs to be done. Okay, I want to give you one example which perfectly illustrates the importance and interrelatedness of these 3 points that I have highlighted from the 10 key messages. And that's the fact that if we look at the COVID-19 recovery packages, that they are not really consistent with the Paris Agreement. Let's look at that from the energy sector perspective. And here I'm using data from the Energy Policy Tracker website, which I encourage you to check out. It's showing that over 40% of the public money commitments go into fossil fuels, and they go into fossil fuels unconditionally. And that's exactly what our first keynote speaker, and Patty Ford, mentioned. There should be no funding going unconditionally into fossil fuels, none whatsoever. So that's completely inconsistent in what is happening. If we look at this by country, of course, you can see differences. There are some countries which are doing much better than other countries. And you probably are not surprised that the United States, which has, it's not following the Paris Agreement anymore, that they are pumping massive amounts of money into the fossil fuel industry without any conditions attached. For the climate, it's still a problem. But then what's perhaps more important is to look at the countries who are still, following the Paris Agreement, who have pledged to climate neutral societies by 2050 and so on. Let's just pick out Germany. Why is there a black bar? There should be no funding going into fossil fuels unconditionally. Another point is funding going into potentially clean energy technologies, and that's the light green bar. Looks good, but it's only potentially green. What does that mean? It means that there's a risk that actually it's not sustainable. And an example for this is electric vehicles, right? We can promote their diffusion, but as long as the electricity system is not decarbonized, it's not really helping it's our climate mitigation targets. Okay. What I want to do now is to zoom in a bit more on really transformative policy mixes. And if you look at these Nightingale roses, then you can see that particularly in our own transition journals, so that's the orange rose with purple inner part, over 60% of the studies on policy mixes are really dealing with transformative policy mixes. And that's a much bigger share than if you compare this to policies. Yeah, most studies, and that's the biggest chunk of studies that we're doing in transitions, in the transitions community, only a fraction of that is looking into transformative policies. And I think that needs to change. So we need to pay much more attention to the transformative policy mixes and transformative policies. And I think this conference has shown that we do. So that's really great. The question, of course, is what makes transformative policies or transformative policy mixes transformative? And I do want to, reach out into this recent dialogue that's happening, and that has been happening here into this in this community about transformative innovation policy, because I think we can learn a lot from that various thinking in the community about what makes policy transformative. And I picked out one study from Des Geers, which tried to show in a very simple way what makes transformative innovation policy and how does it differ from mission-oriented innovation policies and all previous generations of innovation policies still being in place, of course. And so the square that you can see in the top right corner is basically saying, okay, that's where the transformative innovation policy is placed. It's taking societal challenges as its main driver for the policy agenda. So it wants to address these societal challenges, transformative innovation policy, and it adopts a broad understanding of the innovation process. Yeah, so it talks about targeting not only firms and R&D in firms, but targeting really a wide variety of actors, a wide variety of activities, and different modes of innovation. And that's something that's important to consider and to keep in mind. And before saying something about transformative policy mixes, I want to bridge to transformative environmental policy. And I think similar discussions are happening there. And it's really fruitful to bridge these two, right? In the spirit of we need to integrate policy domains. So I've picked again one study from Klaus Jakob and Paul Ikins that say, we need this third generation of environmental policy, this transformative environmental policy needs to create disruptive change. It's not about incremental change. It needs to shape transformations towards sustainability. And it needs to do that in a context where there are lots of countervailing actors, countervailing interests, countervailing institutions, and countervailing power, not only beyond the government, but also within the government. So how do we navigate that? And I think that's one of the main problems that we have, right? We know what we should be doing, but it's really hard to implement it. And so what they are arguing is that transformative environment policy needs to build on social innovation, and that's why I made it like a part of my keynote, and it needs to build on experimentation with institutional innovation. All right, so we need these new forms of innovation, and we need policies that support that. So now I'd like to add like a bit on, okay, what then makes transformative policy mixes. It's of course this joint thinking between different policy domains, but maybe it's a bit more because it's like this broader umbrella of thinking and trying to organize our thoughts. It's almost like a heuristic of thinking about all these policy aspects that may be relevant for transitions. And so in a work in the Pathways project that I did together with Benjamin Fluger and Frank Reels, we were thinking about, okay, what makes transformative policy mixes and can we build them into socio-technical scenarios? And we identified 3 key aspects. The first one is really about, okay, transformative policy mixes need to provide direction, direction of travel. And where we want to travel, should not stay very abstract, right? It needs to be made more concrete. What kind of future does a society want to live in? How does the future need to look like? when we think about how do we want it to look like. So that requires, of course, participatory visioning, really inclusive, so that all stakeholders are on board and that society gets a say in this. And if we have that from the beginning, then we can much easier build the policy mixes over time around that, because we know where we want to go. And then, so in terms of these policy mixes, so here we now at the element of the policy mixes, it's of course important to have policy mixes for creative destruction, right? Promoting the new, but also phasing out the old. And an important element is, of course, to try to be as consistent as possible with your overarching target, with your overarching strategy. But what I think is also really important to have encourage experimentation across multiple actors. Not just firms, really across all actors that are out there, with innovation, social innovation, institutional innovation, business model innovation, and so on, policy innovation, right? And then, on the other hand, we need, to be phasing out support for polluting fossil fuel parts of the regime. And we need to address these transformative policies, we need to address, of course, the negative implications, and I already mentioned this. The third part is about institutional adjustments and governance adjustment being needed for such transformative policy mixes to play out, right? The policy style, the policy processes underlying the development of such processes, the monitoring and the evaluation, and the openness to learning, the talk about different silos, crossing borders. It's a whole lot of changes that are needed. And here we probably also need some, really big picture thinking on how to do this, but then also make it very concrete on the ground. What does it mean? So this is actually an open question, right? It's the beginning of a journey. I think we as a community can have lots to contribute and develop this further. So there are no finished answers, but it's rather an invitation for many people to come on board and to contribute to different parts of the puzzles to get a clearer message out. What do we need to do in terms of transformative policy mixes? So that brings me to social innovation, right? And I will come back to policy mixes. I particularly picked this image as one type of social innovation being campaigns about the global climate movement, because I want to say that, we only have a chance to get really transformative, with radical outcomes, policy mixes, if there is societal pressure. It's not going to happen without that. So to really get policy progress, climate strike movements, other social movements are really central. So there's a next global day of climate action coming up in September. Maybe you want to put this in your diaries. Social innovation, let's look at that. It's a really rich literature and nicely summarized in this book by Frank Mullard and Diana McCallum. Let's look at how much of this rich literature is happening in our transitions literature. And again, the blue line is what we have been publishing in all journals, the orange line, our subset of transition journals. But if you look at the green and the red line, you can see, well, yes, we are working on social innovation, but it's not really a priority. It's rather like a niche within our community. If we just search for social innovation, of course, we can devise more sophisticated search strings, and I come back to that. But anyhow, the message is we don't pay that much attention to it. And my argument is we should be paying more attention to it. The good news is that over half of these studies are looking at transformative social innovation. So I want to go on to talk about social innovation in energy transitions. And I think there will be more more knowledge being created through 4 new research projects starting last year, funded by the European Commission, to really look into the notion of social innovation and its role in energy transitions. And one of them is the Sonnet project, which I lead, and which is focusing on the diversity of social innovation. And it's the processes underlying it in transitions, the contributions and success and future potentials to help accelerate clean energy, sustainable energy transitions. This is a project that's being done by 6 academic partners, each of them being paired up with 1 city partner, and ICLE as our partner to bridge between academic and help with the bridge between academic and city partners in our transdisciplinary work. And we're really building on work from an earlier consortium on transformative social innovation theory, which have just put out their lessons learned for developing a theory of transformative social innovation in a recent research policy article. And so we are building on what they have been doing for a range of sectors and looking particularly on energy. So we have adjusted or applied the definition of social innovation to energy, and it reads as this. It's a combination of ideas, objects, and or action that changes social relations and involves new ways of doing, thinking, and organizing energy. And I'm going to unpack this a bit, but let me first start by probably know the notion that people usually have when they think about social innovation energy, and that's probably more you think about citizen engagement, bottom-up organized civil society groups, perhaps putting solar on the roofs of a community building, and so on, or energy cooperatives, presuming perhaps. So there are really good reviews about that and lots of action on that. But we argue in the Sonne project that actually that's not a complete picture. There is more to social innovation and energy than that. So as a very first stage, we have looked at the literature, trying to see, okay, what's out there in terms of what could be considered as social innovation energy. And you can see it's a really active community. There are nearly 400 articles on social innovation energy sector, but the ones on the bottom are again within our community, the transitions community. Well, most of the discussion on social innovation in the energy sector happens outside of our community, but there are of course notable exceptions. So if we can pay more attention to social innovation, I think that will be a good thing. So what we wanted to do is to look into what are these different types of social innovation energy. And so we developed a typology because there is no such comprehensive typology out there. The ones that are out there only cover specific phenomena. And we thought we really need this because social innovation is so diverse, and we might need some guidance for systematic analysis, but also for better advice and advocacy. So starting with our definition, we went through this, and starting with the changes in social relations, I just want to quickly tell you what we mean by that. And we're building here on Brinkerhoff et al. And differentiating 4 different social interactions, where cooperation is really interaction that occurs when people work together to achieve a shared goal. Exchange is when there's a voluntary interaction, but everyone expects there is some sort of reward. Competition means, well, it's a struggle over scarce resources, but there are shared rules for that struggle and for determining who's the winner. Whereas conflict means, well, there's a struggle over scarce resources, but it's not regulated by shared rules. So that's the first dimension. The second dimension is, new ways of doing, thinking, and organizing energy. So when we say doing, what we mean is all kind of practices related to energy technologies, to the physical composition of the energy system. Yeah, you could think of solar PV generation or electricity storage, maybe in the basement and so on, right? It could be thinking. So that means new forms of knowledge and normative framings. And it is, for example, raising awareness, campaigning, providing advice on energy. And finally, organizing means, governance and organizational structures within initiatives and within the energy system, such as, networks facilitating exchange on energy issues. And if you put this into a matrix, then you already get like your 12 types of social innovation. And we wanted to specify this a bit more. So we did a mapping of 400 social innovation initiatives across a number of European countries. And we really mapped for diversity. So if we identified one type, we looked for other types. And based on that, we then identified 18 different types, 18 different fields, social innovation fields, 18. It's quite a lot, right? So it is diverse. If you want to read more about this, we put this down in our website in a deliverable about this, and Julia Wittmeier has led this work. And what we're doing now is to focus on some of these and conducting both longitudinal analysis with historical case studies, where we want to focus on institutional work and institutional change, if that's occurring within these fields. And we always have a cross-country comparative research design. But we're also doing citizen service in 4 of these fields. So, doing cross-sectional work quantitatively. And we also have, of course, our city labs. Our city labs, where we are, trying out forms of social innovation. And so, how's that relevant for policy mixes? We're finding that we're experimenting with this, or for example, new novel forms of involving citizens in shaping the cleaner energy system in their quarter, or novel forms of crowdfunding, which we're doing in Bristol. So all of this is testing it out, but the cities are really keen to see if it's successful, or if they can learn something from this to scale it then up across the cities in their own transformative urban policy mixes. But we also have this focus across the whole project, across all methods that we're doing on social political issues, mainly focusing on 4 things: collaborative governance arrangements, policy networks, power and policymaking. And you probably, or you might have seen some of this at the conference here. For example, Maria Stadler presenting on policy networks, or Flor Avellino presenting the conceptual underpinnings of our work on power. Okay. Enough on social innovation. If you like more information, we have put together an energy read on that, explaining our take on social innovation and the typology. And there is also a webinar where Julia Wittmeier explains this typology in much more detail. Okay, with that, I'm at the outlook. And I want to close with some ideas for future research and that are emerging from what I have been discussing on transformative policy mixes. And I want to share with you in one slide what my future research will be, but then also more generally what I think we as a field on working on transformative policy mixes should be looking into more in the future. So I've been starting in June a new 5-year project, and my team will be complete in October, and where we're going to be working on the interconnection of the energy mobility sector and looking into how the sustainable energy transition there can be accelerated. And we're looking at this in a way that we want to look at the global interplay, but actually study 4 different countries and what's happening at the regional level in 4 front runner regions, which trying out new things where maybe perhaps we can learn something for transformative policy mixes. And the idea is really to look into this multi-level transformative policy mixes, so in terms of different policy fields, but also different governance levels, and interplay with low-carbon innovations. When I say low-carbon innovation, it's certainly not just technological, but it's really innovation by many actors, whether that's policy innovation, social innovation, institutional innovation. And we pay particular attention to transformative capacities of actors in these transition processes. For the future research of on transformative policy mixes more generally, I think there are like 5 points. The first one is, I think it's really important that we combine theories and concepts from transition studies with policy studies. And that was really the idea to get that going with the special issue that, that Florian Kern led on. I think that's really crucial. It's also crucial to keep up our great, as a field, our attention to actors and coalitions. And particularly in the context of, bringing in theories of the policy process and so on, and looking at policy feedbacks and making that work for transformative policy mixes. I think, of course, it's important also to go beyond technological innovation. That's why I stressed social innovation, but, also remember institutional innovation is really important. Another point is on policy coordination. It's easily said, but it's really hard to be done. And so I think we need more research really on the ground and seeing what could be done, experimenting, perhaps some sandpits in how can we break down these silos, what are new forms, and who is experiencing with that already, and what can we learn from this through systematic comparisons and so on. And finally, I think we should really become a bit more creative in terms of our methods, and particularly in terms of adding to our qualitative methods also more advanced quantitative research methods, such as stemming from the opportunities offered by big data. So in general, I think, as a nutshell, there's much room for future research. And yeah, looking at the time, I think I rather just stop. I did have some final reflections, but maybe we can just do that in the Q&A. So thanks so much for your attention. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your comments and the discussions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karoline. Hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, first of all, congratulations for your 5-year grant, the ERC grant, which is really a big thing. I think I can imagine that you can now do a lot of work with new colleagues. Great.
Yeah.
Okay, we want to have now a Q&A session. And you might want to post your questions already. Shall we start? Good. So the first question is from Rob Raven. What are your thoughts on how to arrive at a transformative policy mix in which the political context is hostile towards sustainable transition? As you already mentioned, the fossil fuel exporting or the fossil fuel funding question.
Yeah, so that's the $1 million question, of course, right? That I hope many of us will be working on and actually looking at the sessions, various sessions here at the conferences. I think we do, and we try to tackle this, which is really good. But I think it's also quite inspirational, the sessions with practitioners and seeing the change in discourse and the attention to this phenomenon, this problem, this barrier to transitions. I think we need to take it step by step, right? We can't do it overnight, and we need to build coalitions, and we need to be an active voice. I actually do think, and that's like one of my reflections, that we need to perhaps reset the priorities a bit to be more involved at this time of really fundamentally thinking of this window of opportunity to be engaged in dialogue with policy, with society, to bring like what we know from our research really to the table, to not only let other disciplines talk, so to take the time to, write blogs, be active on social media, be and perhaps even write like popular books so that the news is coming out, but just to be a voice in that debate and support the coming about in that way. And then it's sequentially. And I think it's about working with the willing policymakers and the willing actors, rather than then who stand in the way. So one reason why I'm doing the Sonnet project on a city level is because we really can work with cities who want to do something, who take the Paris Agreement and the SDGs really seriously, and who want to move things forward. And so, yeah, I think we can prioritize our activities on working with those who really want to be involved in this radical change and want to drive it and want to see our ecological and other crises addressed. So that's a short answer.
Okay, thank you. Another question that fits to that: how to develop an evaluative approach to transformative policy mixes and how it might differ from classical evaluation of policy. This is something that also personally interests me. We just had a session on regulatory experimenting where this evaluation concepts is a big question, how this is going to take place in these policy mixes. So evaluative approaches.
Yeah, that's another really big question, and I do think that it's really relevant to move forward there. There are some promising approaches that are being done, but also particularly in the policy consultancy communities, because in the end we already had policy mixes in place, and if you wanted to see what kind of changes are happening, you always, even if you were just evaluating one policy instrument, you needed to be looking into what was driven by other policies. But it's really challenging to entangle it then, and we don't really have systematically designed policy mixes anyhow, right? They are there. We don't start from a blank slate, We have policies being put in place from different governance levels, and different ministries implement something, and it's not really coordinated. And then what do you want to evaluate? The whole policy mix? Where do you? So first, that's a huge endeavor, but I think that should be done, and it should partly be a communication with governments who are willing to go into this new form of evaluation and experiment with them how to do this. We won't have the solution right away. We need to see and move forward and make progress that way. And I know that there are people thinking about that and looking into how can be evaluated, both in terms of missions, in terms of climate policy mixes, and so on. But it's actually really time consuming. Just mapping the policy mix that is relevant for one domain can take a really long time, because if you're thinking about, well, a certain domain that you would want to transform, let's say like one system, right? Like I've been working on the energy sector, and so let's take that as an example. I mean, there are many subsystems that you could look at. Do you just look at heat? Do you look at electricity more broadly? So you need to pick that. But even then, you would need to map what kind of policies are in place that influence the actors within the system. Jan Ossenbrink and his co-authors at ETH, they have put forward a really nice guideline of how we can actually systematically map these policies. And I think that's a precondition to then be able to evaluate it. So that's like more a bottom-up perspective, thought about from the actors in the system, what parts of the policy mix really influence their activities. And I think that's what we need to do, actually think that way around, not think the top-down way around, okay, what can a certain nation state or a certain ministry do, but rather first see, okay, what is arriving at the actors in the system, and evaluate it qualitatively and quantitatively with them, to then go back to policy making levels and say, okay, here and there need to be changes. But it's a quite colossal project.
I can imagine. Thank you. So Alicia Harley asks on transformative capacity of actors within governance bodies, public, transnational, and others. Do you see the tension between policy actors focusing on transition on the one side and adaptation on the other side?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know a lot about adaptation, so I can't really say much about that. But maybe someone who knows about this can type something in the chat, which unfortunately I can't read, but maybe later. There may be a tension, but I just don't have any empirical evidence on this.
Yeah, there is something in the post, but I think it doesn't make sense for me to read it out. People can read it. A question from Jochen, provocative question. How would you reply to critics saying that policy mix is very academic and not specific enough to inform policymaking?
It's not really very academic. Actually, if you go out and talk to policymakers, I mean, they may not use that word. They may use the word policy package or policy portfolio, but we have been using that, and most of my research has been on Germany or on the UK, but I have been using a certain description of that for a very, very long time, from as long as when we put in the first climate policy. As soon as it was the second, it was like packages. So we always have been talking about climate policy packages. Civil servants think about this. It's not academic in that sense. We just try to conceptualize it and bring a bit of order into what has been quite chaotic at times because of the complexity. But there are actually also ministries, and again, bring an example from Germany, who are trying to bring order into what they're doing. There are posters showing the energy transition policy mix from the German ministry perspective, but also then including the important developments on the European Union level, because of course they matter as well. Or now for e-mobility, doing the same exercise to see, okay, what are the different levels, what's the strategic level, what's happening on the level of instrument and so on, because otherwise you really would be lost. We need to have this overview. And the discussion about single instruments and that carbon pricing could be the only solution, I think that's past. There is a recognition that no, that's actually not the case. We need policy mixes. And I think that was quite, 5 years ago, that was a struggle still with economists, and that was the debate we have. But now the debate is, okay, well, what kind of policy mixes do we need? And it doesn't matter if it's being called policy mix or transformative policy or whatever. It matters that we put some measures into place, both on a strategic, on element level, and of instruments, but also in terms of how we design our government's arrangement, institution arrangement, how we do the policy making. And so I think there are open ears. I think there is room for very constructive dialogue. So thanks for asking that question. I think that, you can see it in all the documents. You can just go and search in the Green Deal and anywhere else. You need to use different terms, but you can see there's a recognition we need, as in one of the sessions was said, we need a diverse and rich policy mix to address this.
Just to follow up from my side, I mean, what do you think about the Green Deal of the European Union in this respect?
Yeah. So I think it's a very promising development on a strategy level, right? It's thinking, okay, where do we want to move? It's a vision. It's partly a roadmap. It's a lot of money attached, so it's really important. It's a window of opportunity to get something going. And it has to deal with the existing policy mix, of course, and needs to not only be layered on top of it, but it needs to actually replace other things. So, I mean, the ambition is really promising, but of course, it really matters how it's being implemented. And there are really big questions about this on all kinds of dimensions. So again, I think it's our opportunity to engage and to be involved, and to share our research findings and to think further of how to harness this point in time to really rethink how we're doing policy and what kind of policy mixes we need to put in place, and importantly, what we need to phase out, what we need to stop doing, and how we need to change the existing policy mix so that we can have this transition and can have the recognition also of the social justice implications.
Thank you. Another question by Rob. Sometimes we refer to coalitions and communities and society to bypass solving political ignorance or hostility towards sustainability. But coalitions, communities, and societies are also conservative. So is this a solution?
Well, if they're just conservative in a way of nature conservation, then that type of conservative shouldn't be a problem. But I mean, there are multiple coalitions, right? There will be, so that's why I'm more stressing, to work with the willing and to build coalitions of those actors who are interested in positive change. But yes, there will be also the coalitions which will stand in the way of that. And then, the political process gets started. And it's a question of then whether it's just that experiments can be put forward, because that's easy, even for the conservative coalitions. Okay, let them try out things, and it just buys us time, and then nothing happens afterwards. But actually, maybe something does happen afterwards, and that's the question of how we, within the experimenting, then perhaps strengthen our coalition and use the momentum in time, because it's always about policy windows, to perhaps institutionalize these things a bit more. And in some areas, we see this is happening, and so that makes me a bit hopeful. But yeah, it's of course not an easy feat.
Okay, thank you. Alexandra Mallet asks, how does the work on transformative environmental policy that you noted is to do with open-ended challenge-led policies, the content with concurrent trends on innovation underlying as such rise? Sorry, it's really hard. It's quite complicated to read. I think the question, or also if I can reframe it for me, could you briefly explain what the core idea of you is, the difference between transformative environmental policy and your approach?
Okay. The transformative policy mix thinking is basically combining transformative environmental policy, transformative innovation policy under one umbrella, right? But if you looked at what the two examples of transformative environmental policy and transformative innovation policy that I gave, they are very closely aligned. They come from different policy traditions, but actually the underlying thinking is actually very, very similar. And I mean, I think these authors also are very much aware about innovation, as people working on environmental policy have been paying a lot of attention for a long time as innovation as a solution to environmental problems, and to look at, okay, how can we design policies and that are innovation friendly. So I don't think that they are far apart, and I think that the idea of the transformative policy mix is just bringing it together and thinking across policy fields. Obviously, when then you still have an environmental ministry and an innovation ministry, and you go and advise them, well, to the one, you need to talk more in terms of transformative innovation policy, but I think we should still say, you know, this needs to be linked with sectoral policies. In a sense, it's similar to us as researchers. You know, we may have some who are experts on innovation policy, and others experts on environmental policy, and others experts on certain sectoral policies. So we also need to come together to work out what is the best possible policy mix that we could suggest. And I think that's also something that we need to be doing more. So yeah, I see it basically as an umbrella where the other things can fit in.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this climate and innovation directorates in ministries, in different ministries. In Austria, actually, at the moment, we have them joined, almost in many respects at least. The climate ministry and the Ministry of Innovation are now in one really big one. So we'll see how this works out. I'm not so optimistic that it will work much better if it's within one ministry. But
yeah, structures are one thing, but then the thing is the people within the structures and the incentives that are in place. So do you have in the leadership position people who really want this bridging to happen?
Yeah.
If yes, that's really helpful. And then if you have within the different, silos, previous silos, people who are willing and who see, yeah, this is the solution really, then that can work. But yeah, it can also just be under one umbrella and nothing else is changing.
Yeah.
So it's a good start, but again, it depends then on the implementation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, coming to social innovation. How far do we get with social innovation? It's not always about the combination of social, organizational, and technical innovation embedded in formal and informal institutions. Or how do you define social innovation? Could you please tell something about the social innovation concept insofar that it does not only mean micro-level practices?
Yeah. I have joined the social innovation research about 2 years ago with the Sonnet project, and working with really experts on this from Drift and from Sprue, who have been working on social innovation for a long time. So I'm basically still a learner, but I already can see how important it is. And I can see that, the definition that we are using is not on social practices. It's based on these social relations between different actors and between new actors, changes in social relations. And that sounds still very abstract, so that's why we try to create this typology and then list the different fields that are actually out there and what's happening there. And that's not necessarily happening on the micro level. So what we are doing now is not looking at individual initiatives, but rather at the whole field, the whole organizational field. And we do that at a national level, actually. So that's where we don't look at the urban level. Of course, we have attention, okay, what's happening at different governance levels, but we really look at the field at the national level. And so we try to see, are these well, the different initiatives, actors in one field, the different social innovation actors, are they really making a transformative change to the wider system they are embedded in, on energy in that case? And I don't have the answers yet because we are in the first year of a 3-year project, but that's really the answers we want to provide. To which extent is this transformative? And I could very well see that, like, for example, the campaigns, one of the parts in the typology was about campaigns, actually campaigns against, campaigns for. So these social movements, that some of them will be having a transformative impact. We may not see this now, but in 5 years, perhaps even later. But it's the same as with the anti-nuclear movement. It had a really transformative impact. It was for Germany and the German energy transition, the nucleus, the starting point to really get things going and to look for alternatives.
Yesterday we also had a session, Just Transition, by the Austrian Chamber of Labor. Would you consider, or what do you consider as those social actors within the energy field?
So what we are doing is to look at any kind of actor, not just citizens. And we're actually adopting like the actor framework that was developed by Flo Avellino and Julia Wittmeier to really be open to any kind of actor who gets engaged with social innovation, as defined. So it doesn't need to be citizens. It could be from the public sector. It could be businesses. It could be from academia, a mix, something hybrid. Social in that way, in terms of actors, is very wide. It's open. Anyone who engages with a certain social innovation would be considered as active actor in our field that we would be looking at. And then, of course, the actors which are counter players, which are working against these changes in contrast to them.
Okay, thank you. I now read 2 questions that fit together, so it might be a little bit long for you. Maybe you want to make notes. And I have difficulties to read from here. Jaco Quist asks, what I miss a bit is the required cultural and structural changes that are needed for sustainability transition. Could you elaborate on how to bring cultural change or changing the economic logic into policy mixes, as is, for instance, discussing in the degrowth community? Here in Vienna, we have a strong degrowth, and at this university, even a degrowth community. So maybe this comes from this side. And Simon Werner asks, how to address the issue of growing energy demand coming from industrializing countries from the global south. Is transformative policy mixes a successful way to change or reduce energy consumption patterns of Western countries? So I think it's several questions.
Okay. So just try to address them in turn. I mean, as someone trained in ecological economics, I take this degrowth debate very seriously, but the research that we have been doing in terms of transformative policy mixes has not been on such a macro level, if you wish. And I'm not aware that there are others who have been using this at this level. In a sense, it's like more that we need to change our underlying social institutions of how we want to operate our economies and our societies. And you could be thinking about policy mixes enabling the dialogue about that, but I think we are rather, I don't know whether that's too useful, but ultimately, if a decision has been made, that we want to go to what Ann Pettifor referred to from Herman Daly, the steady state economy, or however we want to newly define what comes after growth, if you go beyond growth. I think that there's a time for discourse now. And then if decisions are being made, that means changes to our institutional structures. And that also implies that we need to change then the policy mix, of course. But there is much room for thinking, I agree. But I think it's like very important area. So if people want to jump onto this, that would be great. And the second question, more talking about energy and energy in the global south. You have very different starting points, right? Overarching priority is more energy access than decarbonization, at least in many countries. Depending on which countries in the global south you're talking about, of course, there are big variations. And so in that sense, it's about growth in capacity to generate electricity. But then the question is, with what technologies, with which fuels? So ideally, you would have policy mixes in place. They don't need to be as transformative because you don't have to get rid so much of the old thing. You just add new things, and these need to be green. So you need to promote a green niche, but you don't need to think so much about the destabilization. So that there would be a different balance in these kind of policy mixes. And you could think then more about, well, what could be added in to have a build-up of local industries. So think about the industrial policy component and local content in, investing in renewable energies, so that you don't only import technologies, but maybe have, some local production there, which go along with jobs and so on. So rather, that may be a different focus then of the policy mixes, but and also, of course, question about do you go for a decentralized system if the grids are not anyhow always in place? That makes a lot of sense. So it might make it actually much more easy, and the vested interest may be much lower. Yeah, in many countries, not in all, obviously, and that means also that your policy mixes become more easily transformative than it would be in the context of the global north. I hope that answers the question.
I'm sure. Thank you. Okay, I have one last question, because then we come to the final end of the conference. Nicholas Schmidt, from a strategic standpoint, do you think that packaging policies targeted at transition may increase the political feasibility of ambitions and stringent policy, for example, given that costs to actors groups can be hidden there? Where does democratic accountability come into play in the case of introducing such complex packages?
That's a really good question. And I think that's actually what you see happening. Like, think about the German coal phase-out compromise, where we really have this accountability problem, and where the package is certainly not better than if we would have looked at that separately, because much is hidden. I'm not necessarily suggesting that we need to come forward with this great, perfect package or mix. I think it's more a dynamic process over time. Some packaging is anyhow always happening in the policy process, at least in the countries that I have been studying. And of course, then you get into very technical details, and no one really can follow that, right? I mean, talking about policy mixes is like the big picture about coherence and so on, and credibility. But when it really comes down to the actually getting things implemented, it's about the design, and it's not really, doesn't really matter what type of instrument it is. It really matters how the design is, how stringent, how much support to whom, and so on. And over these technical design features, you have the political debates. That's where then the actors jump on and influence policymaking, because that's what really matters then in terms of the money flows and so on, the resources being put forward. And I doubt that you can have this in huge discussions about packages. I mean, you need super well-informed policymakers who have the overview and to totally understand what kind of vested interests are out there. And you need to have a media covering it really well as well, so that actually actors from society could like jump up and say, you know, that what is happening there, we're going to the streets and we're demanding something else. So I think the practical way is rather to go stepwise and to have it broken down into smaller aspects, working these out, but having the big picture view behind this, okay, that you're tackling this and that. And for some, I think you need to discuss it together, and you can have the synergies. But that's again a question where we then perhaps as and transition researchers can advise what would be clever packaging. How could we benefit from the coalitions and the different interests out there, and package things up so that the result is a better one than before, because the compensation can be something that pays off a more stringent policy, or if you want to have like a tax reform, for example, a whole complete package, then of course that's almost as in such a policy mix where you can play around with lots of features and have these political discussions. But the devil is in the detail. And yeah, let's together work on this over the next years and try to provide good policy advice.
Okay. Thank you so much, Karoline. Thank you for your presentation. I take with us your approach on transformative policy mixes and social innovation in this context. Also, thank you for the examples in the energy sector. With this, I want to close this session, and we will, you can all have a short coffee, and we will join together at 4:30 Central European summertime for the Farrell ceremony and the IST award. And some reflections there. So please stay online. Thank you, Karoline, again. I hope to see you again soon, also physically somewhere, maybe in Vienna. Okay.
Yeah, me too. And thanks for the very good questions and the lively debate.
Thank you to the audience for that. Okay. Bye-bye.